Hello there, my name's Iain MacKenzie, and it's a delight to be joining you for Politics Today. This is a really exciting module, and obviously one of the most exciting things about it is that you get to choose one of the topics that we discuss in the module. So really pleased that you've actively engaged with that whole process and come up with Black Lives Matter as the topic for this week. Let me just say a little bit about what I want to do in this lecture today. I don't really want to give, a kind of in-depth overview of the nature of Black Lives Matter. It's not really for me to do that, and I suspect actually many of you probably know a lot more about it than I do in terms of its nature, its organisation, its purpose. You may be members or you may be involved in debates about its nature and organisation and purpose and so on. So I don't really want to kind of engage at that level. What I want to do is try to think about what might be interesting about asking what's different about Black Lives Matter. I want to start with a quote from the suggested reading. It's just a very simple thing. They say, although the BLM movement reflects black feminism and past civil rights movement struggles, it is a uniquely 21st century social movement that uses new technologies for innovative social protest. So what I like about that is that it's obviously recognising the indebtedness to the past, to black feminism and to civil rights movement struggles. But it's also trying to kind of articulate what's unique about Black Lives Matter. And I think that's the question I really want to focus on, is what is it that makes it unique, and what might be the real challenges contained within Black Lives Matter. Now, Numi, Jennings and Fagan give a particular answer to that. They suggest it's the use of new technology for innovative social protest that makes Black Lives Matter uniquely 21st century. I mean, I think that's an interesting claim, and clearly one of the defining features of the Black Lives Matter movement is that it's a hashtag. And obviously it's in the quote, it's not in this particular image that you're seeing on the screen at the moment, which is a kind of subsequent poster used by Black Lives Matter. But it began fundamentally as a hashtag, and that does matter. That does actually signal an important difference about its mode of operation, about the nature of its composition, about how that leads to organisational issues, and how those then reflect in terms of purpose and aims and goals. Okay, that said, I'm not here to kind of tell you about Twitter and social media, and I should be definitely the last person to ever tell you anything about that. I'm quite sure you will all know a lot more about that and how it functions, and the kinds of alliances that can be created through kind of hashtag politics. So I'm interested in that quote from Numi, Jennings and Fagan because it stresses the unique. However, what I'd like to do is offer a different story that comes to a different conclusion about what makes Black Lives Matter unique. So that's really where I want to go with the mini lecture today. Like I say, it's not really a kind of lecture in the sense of giving you a whole lot of knowledge about Black Lives Matter. It's more of a kind of lecture that's a kind of provocation to think about what might be unique about Black Lives Matter when we think about it from the point of view of what it's telling us about the political in the 21st century, not just the use of new technologies. So that's basically where I'm heading. In order to do that, though, it is important to recognise, as these authors do, that the BLM movement does come from a combination of black feminism and the past civil rights movements, and those two elements and how they're inflected through Black Lives Matter are important, and I'll make some points about that as we go along. So just to give you a sense of where I'm heading in this mini lecture, here we go. So I'm going to do a brief review of the her story of BLM. That's important. I'll say a bit more about that in a second. Obviously taps back into that point we were just saying about the importance of black feminism in the origins of BLM. We also then need to recognise the relationship to the civil rights movements, particularly of the 60s. But, obviously, civil rights movement wasn't contained simply in the 60s, but, the high point in terms of the 60s, particularly in America, though again, of course, not exclusively. It's good to just consider the difference between the civil rights movement in America in the 60s and kind of BLM in the 21st century. Those two things will basically kind of set me up with a few general points that will allow me then to consider two kind of important questions. One relates to the notion of rights, and this will be considered through the relationship between BLM and kind of abolitionism. Not everybody involved in BLM would claim to be part and parcel of a kind of abolitionist politics, but there is an important kind of sense in which kind of abolitionism offers something really interesting and telling about the Black Lives Matter movement, but also about how some, at least, consider our contemporary political situation. Again, particularly in America and the kind of post-colonial countries, but more broadly as well. That will be an opportunity for me to kind of draw your attention to some of the work of Angela Davis, a very interesting social and political theorist. So definitely thinking about rights will be crucial. Thinking about this move from civil rights to BLM and from BLM to abolitionism is a question really about rights and what we think about rights. But there's really a kind of question underlying all of that, which is how we think about identity, and in particular the relationship between identity and democracy. So I'll kind of end this short provocation by considering what BLM offers in terms of how we think about questions of identity and how those may or may not be said to relate to democracy. And in particular, whether BLM is one of those movements to be seen as adding to or contributing to democracy, or whether in certain instances, particularly around the kind of abolitionist, but also, as we'll come to see, the queer black feminist perspectives, might be calling for something other than democracy as we know it. And that might not be a bad thing. So complex issues as we kind of walk through them, but that's just to flag them up for the moment. Obviously the image there refers to the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement. Many of you will know that beginning, and I would imagine that many of you will know that the three women who founded the hashtag Black Lives Matter were Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors and Opal Tometi. These three women created the hashtag following the not guilty for Zimmerman after the killing of Trayvon Martin. They were outraged, and they felt the need to express that outrage through this social media campaign. It began as a hashtag, and very quickly, as everybody knows, it became so much more. There are local organisations in cities and in small towns and in all across the world. There are various parts of the online communities that have kind of formed within and around Black Lives Matter, and there are, of course, protests and rallies that we've seen quite recently, of course, in Washington and elsewhere. And I also want to mention the fact, of course, that there are, in amongst all of this, some very interesting and creative practices of resistance where moments of real kind of artistry have been brought to bear in the movement, both online and offline. And all of this adds up to Black Lives Matter being an incredibly kind of diverse but very intriguing social movement to try to understand. It doesn't have a straightforward hierarchy as the three originators kind of wished. However, it's also worth noting that partly because of that, their role as the originators of Black Lives Matter has, in some instances, not all, been erased. At least to the point where Alicia Garza felt the need in 2014 to write the her story that is listed on the reading, to kind of remind people that it was an organisation, as she put it, rooted in the labour and love of queer black women. Now, at one level, one might say that's not important, that's just who they were. They were activists doing the Black Lives Matter thing, and it's had a terrific success. At another level, I think that might be important, and I'd like to kind of come back to that as the discussion goes on, just to kind of think about how this might reframe kind of questions of identity and help us rethink notions of rights and democracy. So BLM, therefore, as we know, and again, this is just a very back of the envelope kind of summary, is a social movement, began online, moved offline, local, networked, remains a combination of online and offline, very creative, very lively and very vociferous, and at the moment, particularly, of course, as we saw around many of the major kind of events that in some respects defined the Trump administration. So defined and characterized in that sort of way. But one of the interesting things I want to draw your attention to is that, created out of the labour and love of three queer black women is not unimportant, because these three queer black women were very aware of the complexities of notions of rights and how they apply to people, and how identities can be used both to embrace and to exclude. And so, that sense of their self-identification, I think, is something that becomes important as we consider Black Lives Matter a little bit more. We can do that by thinking about the relationship between the civil rights movement and Black Lives Matter. I mean, it is straightforward in some respects to say that by and large, of course, not exclusively, not in all cases, but by and large, as acknowledged by people like Alicia Garza, the civil rights campaigns of the 60s were led by black, heterosexual, cisgender men. And BLM was created by these three queer black women. In itself, I don't think that's the key thing. It's not just the fact that there were black men leading the movement in the 60s and kind of three queer black women who created Black Lives Matter. I don't think that's fundamentally the key. The key is kind of what this might indicate in terms of both rights and identities, because that's really, I think, where some of the issues begin to become a bit more interesting. Again, we're not going to get caught up in all the kind of complexities about and complex histories about who was involved, who wasn't involved, and so on and so forth. It's just a kind of a marker for a more kind of theoretical point about what Black Lives Matter might mean in terms of its debt to civil rights, but also in terms of why it's different from the civil rights movement. The debt, I think, is quite straightforward. The debt is that there is a very strong sense that black people in America are not able to access the full suite of democratic rights that particularly white people in America are able to access. And there is a strong echo of the civil rights campaign, therefore, in the Black Lives Matter protest. There is, however, something else. There's a very strong sense that the civil rights campaign actually gained a lot of rights for black people in terms of voting rights and civil, political, economic rights, equality acts, and so on and so forth. But that isn't enough. That for some reason, the systematic maltreatment of black people continues, despite black people having the democratic rights that white people have. So that leads us to the idea that there might be something else that needs to be considered here. There might need to be a a deeper, more structural, systematic analysis of the inequalities in order to consider why it is that black people are still suffering at the hands of some white people, particularly some in the police force. That was, of course, the trigger for the whole movement. So when we start to kind of think about those issues, it kind of asks us to reflect on what the nature of those structures might be. So what are the structures of domination that may well mean that it's impossible to secure equality through equal rights? So why might it be that equal rights are not enough? Well, if that's a question that makes sense to you, then you're probably already in this mindset. You will already be thinking about these structures, and you'll probably have your own name for those structures, or the structure that you think matters most. Some of the ones that circle around the Black Lives Matter movement, I think, are important. The first I want to mention is heteronormativity. There is a kind of a sense that the structures within, say, American society, but also more broadly, kind of Western liberal democracies, that kind of vague phrase, but that kind of idea, that the rights enshrined in those democracies favour heterosexual people, and in so doing, that cuts across all sorts of other issues, including issues of race. We then also see questions of patriarchy emerge within that, how the systems and structures seem to favour men rather than women. And we see, of course, also capitalist economies structured in a way that favour some rather than others, in fact a very small percentage rather than others. I mean, I'm just mentioning a few here. These are just alongside notions of the systematic domination in terms of race, which I'll turn to in a second. But I'm just mentioning those because these are part and parcel of the kind of complex understandings that the founders kind of wanted to bring to bear to Black Lives Matter. As queer women, they understood the exclusions that come with heteronormativity. As women, they understood the exclusions that come from patriarchy. And as black queer women of typically not of the capitalist class, they understood the role that capitalism plays in exploiting many within it. So here we see that there are kind of ways of naming structures of domination that may mean that civil rights are not enough. And Black Lives Matter, I think, has foregrounded those structures of domination in interesting ways. And this means that it may well be that just fulfilling the promise of democracy is not enough. And I'll return to that in a second. For a moment, let me just kind of pick up on one of these kind of structural issues, but in particular related to the question of race, of course, because yes, it's about heteronormativity, yes, it's about patriarchy, yes, it's about capitalism, but fundamentally, of course, Black Lives Matter is about black lives, and we should really kind of focus there. And I think one of the interesting ways of thinking about Black Lives Matter is how certain sections of the Black Lives Matter movement, again, not all, it's a kind of complicated and diverse and very localized movement, so lots of different things going on, but some of the sections of Black Lives Matter are very kind of inspired by abolitionist work that's been done in particular by, for example, Angela Davis, just to kind of link it back to the reading list again. So I just want to say a little bit about abolitionism and the kind of issues that it raises. This is a very thin surface account of it. I'm not, I would love to go into it in more detail, but I'm raising it just as a kind of provocation here. You can read some of Angela Davis's work for yourselves. I think it's really approachable, it's really engaging, it's very challenging, raises a lot of big issues, and I would certainly recommend that you have a look at that. So abolitionism, well, in the first instance, it seems to be quite straightforward. One might just say it's about, abolishing the inequalities of that black people face in America, rooted, of course, in the abolition of slavery. So it's about rekindling that sense of the abolitionist movement in order to see then how the inequalities that black people face can be abolished. So there are, however, different ways of thinking about this. And an important way of thinking about it, just to kind of connect back to what I was saying a second ago, is that it's not deemed to be enough to simply fulfill the project of democratic rights, at least in the formal sense, in order to abolish the system of slavery that has kept black people in America and elsewhere in a position of inequality. So what else is required? Well, the diagnosis of the problem is really interesting. It's basically saying that there are deep structures built into, again, particularly American society, that continued the project of enslaving people even after the end and the abolition of slavery. So the claim is that the abolition of slavery in a formal legal sense wasn't actually enough, because the deep structures of domination embraced the project of enslavement in order to continue it in different ways, in different guises. Most notably, for people like Angela Davis, this takes place through the prison system. She talks about the prison industrial complex in a direct echo of the military industrial complex, and has a really fascinating analysis of how prison is used as the key mechanism of the enslavement of black people throughout America, but again, not just America. So if that's the analysis, that there's a continuing structure of enslavement despite the abolition of kind of legal slavery, if you like, then how does one change that? Well, one changes it by abolishing that system that has continued the practice of enslavement. So one would look to quite literally abolish the prisons. Equally, one of the other places that Davis and others believe that this continued structure of enslavement has taken place is through the police. And, unsurprisingly, of course, because, when we think back to the beginning of Black Lives Matter, it was about a police killing of a young black man, and the fact that the police officer was found not guilty. So this has also led then to calls to defund the police and rethink entirely what's going on there. Okay, these are important kind of headlines, but we do need to remember that actually it's not just a call to, do away with prisons, to do away with the police and other structures of domination, full stop, that's it. There is actually a very interesting and important set of alternatives that get proposed by Angela Davis and by many others. You'll see this in one of the video clips, put it on the reading list as well, where there's a really interesting conversation about how to, yes, abolish those kind of systems of enslavement that remain within the prison industrial complex, but at the same time, or as part of that process, to create and establish new forms of community relationship. And it's really interesting that there's a lot of talk now about the role and the value of communities in establishing new kinds of relationship, new ways of thinking about how one will help and support people who might step out of line, but also new ways of thinking about how security can be maintained and so on and so forth. So it's not that these issues are completely disappearing, it's just that people want to rethink them and ask the question, do we need prisons? Do we need the police? Do we need to have these things if it is indeed the case that these are the organizations in which the structures of enslavement have been continued despite the formal end of slavery. So that creates an interesting dynamic and interesting discussion, typically very local focused, very much thinking about where local communities can create their own sense of belonging, their own sense of inclusion, and so on. Now, that's an interesting set of issues. I do want you to reflect, maybe in discussion in the seminar or just kind of for yourselves, about what the role of community might be there. Community, on the one hand, can seem like a very sustaining and supportive part of our lives. Of course, it might also feel like it can be quite an oppressive and quite constraining part of our lives, maybe depending what kind of community you feel you come from. How would you navigate that? What kind of communities do you think can be really supportive and really creative of new forms of relationship? And what kind of communities seem to hold that back, and why? And thinking that through, I think, is a large part of what really is important about the Black Lives Matter movement. I want to sum up a little bit here with a quote from Angela Davis, because it just brings a lot of these themes together quite nicely. So I know it's there on the screen, but I'll read it out for you nonetheless. When equality is measured in terms of access to repressive institutions that remain unchanged, or even become strengthened by the admission of those who were previously barred, it seems to me that we need to insist on different criteria for democracy. So just pause there for a moment. I mean, this is an important version of a very long-standing kind of debate, particularly within feminism, where a lot of feminists have kind of said, well, look, it's not enough that women are given access to the boys' club, because actually all that means is that the boys' club just becomes ever stronger. We need to dismantle the boys' club in order to then rethink how we might have different kinds of gender relationship. And here, the same kind of claim is being made. If I can put it starkly like this: it's no good black people simply getting access to the white structures of oppression, because those white structures of oppression will then just be replicated and, indeed, as she says, strengthened. We need to rethink the relationship between and within all of us. She then goes on to say, okay, well, this rethinking will give us a new criteria for democracy. And then she kind of runs through what you might understand by that. Substantive as well as formal rights. It's an interesting notion. What does she have in mind? Well, she gives us some examples. The right to be free of violence. The right to employment, housing, healthcare, and quality education. So these are some examples of the substantive rights she wants to kind of suggest need to be embedded, rather than just the formal legal rights that then will just effectively replicate the system of oppression and actually kind of strengthen it in the end. Her summary for that is, in brief, socialist rather than capitalist conceptions of democracy. And that's an interesting kind of claim, because here we see a classic kind of critique of the structures of oppression within a democratic society, calling for a new kind of democracy, in her vocabulary here at this moment, a socialist kind of democracy based upon rights to employment, housing, healthcare, quality education, and so on. So that kind of captures, I think, a lot of the issues, but also a lot of the complexities around the shift from the civil rights movement through to BLM, through to abolitionism, because what we get here is a sense in which we need to dismantle structures rather than simply have access to those structures of oppression. But we also then have a sense that there's a kind of continuation of the democratic project, a continuation in the basis of substantive rather than formal rights, but still, therefore, on the basis of rights. And therefore, we get a new kind of democracy that she wants to call socialist rather than capitalist. So therefore, again, appealing to a kind of deeper sense of kind of how issues of exploitation must be dealt with thoroughly at an economic and social level. That's just one version, but it's an interesting one. and it raises lots of interesting tensions about the issues I've talked about. I think you could easily spend a seminar, if you wished, just talking about that quote, and I think that might be an interesting task. What I want to raise is what it says about that last bit in particular. We understand from the civil rights movement that really, what was motivating it, and this was clear from all the identity-oriented politics, the gay and lesbian rights movement, the women's rights movement, the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland, and so on and so forth, that the civil rights campaigns of the 60s were looking to kind of fulfill and complete the democratic project. There were people who felt excluded from the democratic project because of their identity, who wanted then to become part of a fully functioning democracy, who wanted to have full and unfettered access to the democratic project. And in that sense, I think it's a really, of course, that was partly what made them such inspiring visions in the first instance. What is BLM, though? Is BLM about completing the democratic project in that sense? Kind of saying, look, you're missing a bit. You're missing a bit that is Black lives. We matter, and therefore let us in, and we will have access there to the democratic project, and that will help complete and fulfill the democratic project. Or is it, and there's a hint of this in Angela Davis's quote, a recreation of the democratic project? Okay, so we don't want to simply fulfill the project as laid out, but we want to recreate or rethink what we mean by democracy, and in doing so, we can then shift the whole debate forward, for example, around substantive as opposed to formal rights, and so on and so forth. Or with the kind of link to abolitionism, is it really that the BLM movement, or aspects of the BLM movement, again, I shouldn't just kind of unify it in too simple a way, that aspects of the BLM movement in fact are looking beyond the democratic project, looking to something that might be even more than democracy? What could possibly be meant by that? I mean, surely that doesn't sound right. I mean, I can see that might seem like a kind of strange thing to say. But let's think about, some of the key issues that get mentioned here. I focused on rights. Rights have a root in modern Western individualist notions of ownership. Right? It's very possible to rethink the basis of rights, but it's also understandable when people think that there's an echo of that legacy of individual ownership that remains. And of course, individual ownership can be a fantastic thing because one can own oneself and be free, but can also be used, as we saw all too directly in the colonial legacy of Western democracies, as a way of enslaving other people who are deemed not to own themselves, but to be owned by slave owners. So, rights might be a tricky thing to be looking to complete or to fulfill. Perhaps rights need to be unpicked, and we need to think of a different language to help us understand how we can change and remove and abolish the structures of enslavement in modern Western democracies. Underneath that, I would suggest, is the question of identity. The rights, as we've come to understand them in the Western tradition, were linked to a notion of the individual. The individual might be a problematic concept of identity. In fact, it may well be that all forms of identity-oriented thinking are problematic. I'm going to mention that with a little provocation that takes us right back to the beginning of the her story of BLM. Alicia Garza described the three women who started BLM as queer black women. The queer is really important in that. Yes, there are debates about what is meant by it, and I certainly don't pretend to be kind of defining it in one way or the other, but one way that it has been defined and that it can continue to be defined is that queer precisely challenges the very idea of being identified as anything. So when we think about queer black women, it's actually queer is a kind of challenge even to the notions of black and to women. And that, I think, is something that we see embraced in the three originators of the movement, and in some of the kind of complex politics that have followed. What it suggests to me is something very interesting. The democracy is typically requires us to have a very strong sense of our own individual identity. We then express that identity through typically the voting system, and then we get into complexities around representatives and so on and so forth. If we feel troubled by being identified in certain ways, or even self-identifying in certain ways, then it might be that we need to rethink how we manifest the more fluid identities through or in political ways. And the question, I think, aspects of the BLM movement raise really interestingly is whether democracy is the right mechanism for thinking about how that could be done. And maybe one of the challenges of the abolitionist movement is to think about what it might mean to move beyond democracy, because perhaps in the moving beyond democracy into another form of political system, that might be necessary, because it might be the only way to embrace all the differences that matter, including the black lives that matter. I've raised a lot of questions. That's deliberate. I'm not giving you an overview of the movement as, in terms of its kind of, factual kind of account of it. I want to raise this kind of political question and have you discuss it in your classes. So let me just kind of summarize again. What do you think is unique about Black Lives Matter? How do you think Black Lives Matter relates to the civil rights movement? What do you think are important about rights? Are rights the appropriate way of articulating political demands? What do you think is the distinction between formal and substantive rights? What do you think of Angela Davis's quote, in particular, her list of substantive rights, and her claim that actually what this amounts to is a socialist rather than capitalist version of democracy? And then finally, do you actually think that democracy is enough if, in fact, we're looking to include all the differences that matter, including the black lives that matter? Thank you. It's been a pleasure.